This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. Recently, power outages, some lasting weeks and some just hours, have become a regular part of daily weather reports. It's made me wonder how the energy we use is generated and distributed in our state, and if there's really going to be changes in the aftermath of Sandy. There's no one better to ask than Jim LaRocca, Commissioner of the New York State Public Service Commission and an expert on energy, and my guest today. Welcome.
I don't know if I can live up to that, but it's nice to be here.
Good to say that. You were the first Commissioner of Energy in New York State, right? When, that was quite a while ago.
In the first Kerry administration, so which is when you and I first linked up, right? And
what interested me is that you led the development of a master plan for energy in the state. You know, is that the last master plan, the only master plan that's been done?
Well, there have been iterations or reiterations of it. And the most recent sort of overarching look, at least with regard to electric energy, was something called the Energy Highway, which Governor Andrew Cuomo has initiated and which is cooking right along right now.
It's interesting. He initiated it before Sandy.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that had they done enough work to be able to? What happened? How did they put it all together?
Well, the core idea there was that New York City and Long Island, which consume enormous amounts of electric energy in general, but electric energy in particular, are at a very great distance from a lot of the sources of energy. So the business of delivering energy over great distances has to be an essential part of the thinking. And it has always been, but especially now.
It's fascinating to me. So is there a map with all the pipelines?
Oh, sure. You can see a map with gas pipelines, electric.
For the whole state?
For the whole country, for the whole of North America.
Right.
And increasingly, you and I can remember in the 1960s, and there was this massive blackout. And then how many years ago was that blackout triggered by the wrong switch in Ohio or something, blacking out half the country? So the system is increasingly interconnected. It is still vulnerable in some respects because of those interconnections, but it's also benefited because power can be moved much more easily from one place to another than it used to be.
So when you want to put a new pipeline on, how do you do it? Is it like a land use procedure in New York City?
It's similar. There are, depending on the kind of pipeline, the size. Now, I presume you're talking about natural gas, which is the big issue of the day. Yeah. There's a whole process. The New York State Public Service Commission is involved, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the federal government in all its hats, if it crosses state lines. A lot of the gas that comes into New York has origins in Western Canada. A lot of electricity that comes down from Hydro-Quebec has its origins north of the border. So it's really a very, at least as to North America, a global system.
And is every area now able to get gas delivered to them?
Natural
through
gas.
The pipe? Yeah.
Yes and no. There's natural gas available pretty much everywhere, but the density of the population really determines the economics of bringing it house to house. I get approached about this all the time. People say, I live in a certain place, I want to get natural gas. The question for regulators is, can you impose the cost, the relatively high cost per capita of a low density area on an entire community, or can you say to the people that want it, well, you have to pay for a pipe from here to there? Yeah. When people sometimes don't have enough company that want to do the same thing. So, but the trend line is natural gas is, and you ask about the master plan, one of the key features of the plan we put forward in the late 1970s was go gas. We saw natural gas as largely North American, from Mexico to Canada and through the U.S. Relatively clean burning in many of the ways that we are concerned about, certainly compared to coal and coal dust and coal ash and all that. So the amount of energy that is now produced by natural gas, including a lot of electric energy, because one of the things we began doing in earnest in those years was to require power plants that burned oil, even those here where we required they burn a very clean level of oil, have the ability to burn gas instead and go to dual fuel. And for the most part in recent years, they've gone to gas when they have the option because it has been cheaper and it's easier to comply from an environmental point of view. So go gas was a big matter. It still is.
Where in those days did the gas come from?
Here and there and everywhere. The Southwest, the Gulf of Mexico, Western Canada.
Not from New York, though. They weren't doing that whole...
There were experimental wells,
they were
which is
that far away.
Perhaps a way to segue into this fracking question. But gas and oil in this country really began in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Western New York. And a lot of the fracking activity that's now controversial is in those areas where all of this began when John Rockefeller and a couple of other guys said, hey.
They should be used to it.
Yeah, but it's been a long time since there's been widespread activity there.
I remember in early 60s, we were involved in a renovation of a couple of brownstones in Manhattan, and we were waiting for the gas pipeline to come down. So it was, I guess it's a long time ago. I think it's not yesterday, but anyway, when you think about how long ago it was.
And in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Union Gas Company of those days had something called the Cinderella Project, where they were helping not just rehab neighborhoods, but putting gas in gas lamps and restoring that flavor of old Brooklyn. Of course, it became difficult to say, well, we should be just burning it for lighting in front of the house, nice as it looked, but there's a lot.
So the electric power, though, comes from, that's from what?
Power plants.
Power plants.
Yeah.
And they're either nuclear power plants or?
New York has 6 or 7 nuclear power plants. 2 of them right up here in the Hudson Valley at Indian Point.
Right.
There was a 3rd one there that never really operated. And then 4 of them along Lake Ontario. So nuclear has been a big part of the electric mix in New York. And these plants have been there so long and relatively efficient that they are a relatively lower cost part of the mix these days.
Are they safe? Is that a question?
That's the question always. Certainly
not only because they're nuclear, but because they're old.
Well, I would say
matter?
that the regulatory process, it's like older airplanes. The engine is new, the metal fatigue has been tested, all of that. So these plants are always in a state of relative newness by the regulators. The problem has been over time that the federal government has not done a good job of figuring out where to go with the wastes, because nuclear plants produce spent fuel, water that's contaminated one way or the other, and that has to go somewhere because its shelf life of radioactivity is measured in tens of thousands of years. And so one of the big problems that New York faces with its inventory, as in the rest of the country, is that the plants themselves increasingly have nowhere to put the nuclear wastes. And the federal repositories that were to be created, and for which the federal government has collected billions of dollars from ratepayers, don't exist.
Is that New Mexico and places like that?
There are places out west,
which have
but there are places,
strong opposition.
But there are places in Carolina, there are places in the state of Washington and Idaho.
But not New York.
Not in New York. Well, there was one, a famous place called West Valley. Governor Rockefeller thought this was a good business for Western New York, and it was a debacle. That happened during my time. To date, New York and the federal government have spent over $1 billion in a place near Jamestown, New York, cleaning up a relatively small nuclear waste dump.
So how do you transport nuclear waste?
Well, carefully. There are canisters and special trucks and all of the rest, but it has to be moved with great care. It's very carefully regulated, and there's not a lot of it being transported around because the repositories that the federal government was creating,
No place to take them.
they take some low-level waste here and there, but they really are not in the business yet of a system for long-term disposal of used uranium.
So there's going to come a point, though, then, if you can't dispose of it, what are you going to do with it? Is that true?
An argument I made in that first energy master plan is New York should not license or agree to any licensing of additional nuclear power plants until there was a plan for the waste. Well, 35 years later, there's still no plan for nuclear waste, and New York has not agreed to another nuclear power plant. So the kind of issues you see at Indian Point and increasingly on Lake Ontario about wastes, in places where there is acceptance of the plants, along the Lake Ontario, those communities are perfectly accepting. For one thing, they're rurally located.
Right, so it's...
At Indian Point, you have a population issue and all that, but they still don't have a plan for the wastes.
Now, the state doesn't really own any of the companies delivering any of these products?
Well, the state owns the New York Power Authority,
Yes.
which is the old Robert Moses.
Oh, so
they
they
built St. Lawrence, they built Niagara, which are still owned by the New York Power Authority.
And then they have one down here, don't they, in Long Island?
They have a smaller plant in Holbrook, but they at one time owned one of the plants at Indian Point. And so the New York Power Authority is still a principal generator, hydropower.
Yeah,
St. Lawrence and Niagara are two of the best investments New York ever made. A principal investor and operator of the power lines that bring hydropower from Quebec and Canada into the state. So the NYPA is a very important player and is recently, at the governor's request, examining the LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority situation. Speaking of a can of worms.
Now, you used to were you the chair of LIPA?
Yes, for a year. Right.
Right, and that must have been an experience.
It was an experience, one of the migraine experiences of my public career.
But LIPA is now, as a result of, is it because of the response to Sandy, or is it's a continuous problem, isn't it, LIPA?
Well, you know, LIPA was badly conceived, we would have to say. Its original purpose was to see to the decommissioning of the Shoreham nuclear power plant. And it did that. But it did it in a very Rube Goldberg sort of a way. And then, because the agitation on Long Island continued, it was expanded to operate sort of like a public authority, or as a public authority, but sort of like a municipal utility, but not really. So it's a hybrid. So it's a public authority that uses a private company, used to be Keyspan, which was the successor to Lilco. Now it's National Grid, which bought Keyspan, which is a British company. So you have a public authority operating a private company, and together they're supposed to run the Long Island power system. And in this storm is that outages were greater than people would tolerate. The storm was worse. There were communications issues and otherwise. So Governor Andrew Cuomo has said, this isn't working. At least it's not working well enough for the kind of thing we just went through and are likely to go through again. It may not even be working properly for day-to-day, routine stuff.
Right. Oh,
so he has ordered a very comprehensive re-examination of this whole history. He has reached the conclusion already that probably the concept of this hybrid, as long as it has operated, was flawed in its structure, that you can't be both things, perhaps. Right. So among the things he's asked for an examination of a full return to a privatized private company, or a full municipalization. Right now we have a little bit of both.
It would be like the Port Authority giving some other company the duty of operating the tunnels. Would that be like that?
That would be an example.
Yeah.
But you know, the original LIPA was to take over Shoreham and decommission it. And then it began to grow. It had a very active and ambitious director who did a lot of fancy financings, and the financings were done in a way that gave people rate relief, which was very exciting, except what they didn't understand is that he was borrowing the money to
Well,
do
that's for me.
so that is all coming due. So you have now a company, the Long Island Power Authority, with $7 billion in debt, exclusively on the back of Long Island ratepayers. That's like a non-amortizing loan. They're not paying it down. They just keep rolling it and rolling it and rolling it. And there's no community on earth that can support that much debt and be competitive in the ways it wants to be competitive. So the governor has got all the right questions right up on the table. He's taking no prisoners. He doesn't come at it with a point of view except that this is not a tolerable or an acceptable from a public policy point of view, from a political point of view, from an economic point of view. And I think he will, what will emerge from this debate, which is hot and heavy right now, is a more rational way to deal with electric energy on Long Island.
So what happened with Sandy? How does it affect all of our plans?
Sandy demonstrated all the vulnerabilities, all the fault lines in the system. Nowhere in the planning for our electric system or gas system downstate was a flood of this dimension. Let us remember that Sandy was, in many respects, a conventional storm, but with an enormous flood profile that we hadn't seen before. And take Manhattan. All of Manhattan, basically, all of the edges are landfill going back.
Right.
FDR,
Yeah. The
all
FDR
West Side,
highway, right.
all of those. And they all flooded right up and into the hospitals along that were scattered along the east side. So you have a lot of learning here that hadn't ever happened before. And we cannot assume that there won't be another flooding storm of that dimension. So what has to change is all the ways in which the system is vulnerable to that. Communications, copper wire and salt water do not mix. So conventional phone service and computer lines that are in the copper wire area really need to be changed where they're that vulnerable, and that's happening in Lower Manhattan.
Is fiber optic?
Fiber optic is the newer.
Thing.
There's versions of it, but it is the non-metallic successor. And in newer places, newer buildings, of course, that's what you see.
And this is all underground.
In Manhattan, virtually everything is underground, right? But we even lost a gas station at 23rd Street. There are fewer gas stations operating in Manhattan Island now.
So now who's going to be responsible for those plans?
The governor has used a series of commissions under the Moreland statute and otherwise. He had already initiated the Energy Highway planning. He has made planning much more viable and current than it has been in a long time. And I think the way he's approached it reflects that it is even more interconnected and reliant on all its working parts than before. It's like whack-a-mole. You hit something here, something pops up over here. It's all related. And what's happening in natural gas has a bearing on electricity. What's happening in Canada has a bearing on prices. What happens with fracking or not has a bearing on all of this discussion. So bringing it back to an overarching concept and plan, and I'm reminded as the governor does this, something Governor Rockefeller used to say, he wasn't that interested in plans, but he loved planning. And the process of bringing it all together, which really, in a complex environment, is an ongoing process, is the one that he has reconstituted. And he's got all the right players.
Because we don't really plan as governments very much.
Not until we're in a crisis.
Yeah.
But to the governor's credit, this began early in his new administration.
Yes,
he
before.
saw this as one of the areas of public policy that had not been updated.
So now explain to me, we have all these different systems. You've got National Grid, you've got Con Edison, you don't have Keyspan anymore, that's gone?
Except Keyspan is still the gas company for Brooklyn and Long Island.
So now with all the planning and the coming up with new plans and saying we have to replace for the telephones and the computers, and we have to do all of this, what power does the state have to do that? Are these companies licensed to do this?
The company with the utilities that operate with franchises in a monopolistic environment are regulated by the New York State Public Service Commission. They are private companies regulated by the public regulatory body. The public authorities, like NYPA, are subject to a form of self-regulation, but they are all subject to the oversight of the legislature and the governor.
And where does the Power Commission come in?
The
Power Authority.
The Power Authority is
just for the
Power
things
Authority
they operate.
Except that Governor Cuomo has used them in a much broader sense now. They're intimately involved in the energy highway, the planning functions throughout the electric and gas system. The president of the Power Authority, along with the chairman of the Public Service Commission, were detailed to Hicksville during the storm to oversee the storm response. So all of these tools, all of these entities are being deployed in a much more activist way, not just in the planning, but in the management of going forward.
And that's including telephone lines and television. And
well, you have telecommunications now, where the federal government has taken a lot of reach away from the states.
Oh, it has?
Oh, yeah. The process, and some of it is logical in the sense that the system is
so
national, but in my judgment, and now I'll speak as a member of the Public Service Commission, one of 5 members, that the states probably lost too much jurisdiction because in many places there is not as much competition as may have been anticipated that justified the disengagement of state regulation. In Manhattan, for example, how many cable choices do you have?
Right.
The argument is still, well, you could always go to a wire through the telephone or to a disc and so forth. So there are competitive choices, but there's a growing discomfort on the part of the public that the prices go up and up. State has always taken the position.
Terrible.
We don't have any content police.
No.
But the state has always taken the position that as long as there is a competition, that it has a leavening effect.
But there are areas
but
where there
the question is whether the competition is real,
right,
and whether it should be regulated at all, because I don't know of anything that you watch on cable or I watch on cable, with the exception of this program, of course, that you could live without. You see? And so people have come to think of cable entertainment as a utility. And it's not in the traditional historic way we think of utilities.
It's not
utilities are electric and gas and communications, at least in terms of telephone over time, where there was a monopoly and your life could depend on these services. Cable is grown now to so intimate in people's lives that the public increasingly wants it subject to more regulation.
Well, when you said that the FCC took power away from the states, I was a little surprised, because it seems to me the FCC doesn't do very much anymore. Am I wrong?
Well, it wasn't the FCC who took it. It was the Congress who took it, with
aided
and abetted by a president of the United States.
And
so,
did they give it to the FCC?
The FCC does not always demonstrate the kind of consumer orientation that we have the closer to the ground. So a state utility board like the PSC in New York is more likely to be closer to consumers. We in the New York State Public Service Commission have an entire office right here in Manhattan just filled with people who see consumers all day long. They bring their bills, they have an advocate who can sort out issues, connections, reconnections, all of that sort of thing. That has lost some ground in recent years as the feds, in telecom, as the feds have taken the broader authority.
This is a silly question, but can you run, if fiber optic isn't copper, then can you run that through a gas line pipe?
You mean like a natural gas?
Yeah.
I don't know specifically. All of these corridors tend to house all of the parts.
So they do.
I don't know that it's necessarily in the same piping.
I see. I was just wondering.
It's different species, and I don't know that they mix very well.
How much would it cost, and it's impossible, I guess, to put all the things underground?
Well, in 1977, there was a winter storm, And Governor Carey ordered a study of undergrounding the Long Island Lighting Company above ground system. And the figure in 1977 was $7 billion. Now come forward from 1977
Would be much
to now.
Yeah.
Long Island, Westchester, Orange, and Rockland, these are above ground systems for the most part.
Right.
And the cost, particularly on Long Island where you have a high water table, you don't just put it underground, you have to put it in vaults and all that. The number is such that the discussion really ends there. There's lots of things you can do to harden the system to make it better, but a full undergrounding, particularly in the competition for dollars we're in this era, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
So you're optimistic about the delivery of energy in the state.
I am.
Yeah.
I'd like to see my gasoline prices a little lower, as you would, but and it was interesting. This storm had an impact on the gasoline delivery system, which we hadn't seen before of this dimension. So one of the things the governor is looking at is the storage and delivery system for gasoline, motor fuels. But yeah, I think we should be optimistic. There's a lot of solid stuff going on. We didn't talk much about it today, but in all of this mix, the renewables, which are being heavily invested in by the state through the PSC, through New York State ERDA, which is the research and development arm, through NYPA, through LIPA when it can, through the private companies at the direction of the PSC, all of that is happening. And so renewables, as you look at the mix, are getting a bigger slice of the pie.
That's great.
And that's good.
I think you're right. We're going to have another program. As usual, you are so filled with information, and I still have so many questions. So we've come to the end, and I'm sorry, but I'm glad you're pleased. And it sounds like this governor is really doing a very good job for us.
He's taken on, these are not subjects that excite people except when things go wrong.
Right.
But he's been at it since he got there, and that's a good thing.
Well, thank you very much, Jim LaRocca.
Good to see you, Ronnie, as always.
Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.